Today's tutorial is on a beautiful little piece called Rêverie by Debussy, and it's one of those pieces at the more accessible end of his repertoire. As usual with my tutorials, I'll focus predominantly on how we can go about practicing this, as I think having the right practice strategies is the thing that makes the biggest difference for how easy it is for us to learn something. So if you're sitting comfortably, then let's begin. I believe we should always take some time to discover a piece. Even if we feel we already know something, I find it extremely important to try to get a better acquaintance with it, even before sitting down at the piano. I always like to listen to a variety of recordings. Now, given this is such an iconic piece of music, we can find a large variety of recordings of it by some of the world's greatest pianists, both past and present. The first thing I noticed is the amazing variety of tempi that I use to play this. As I'm not a metronome fan, I usually simply look at the length of time it takes a pianist to play something end to end. I found recordings as short as 3 minutes 30 and others in excess of 6 minutes. Find one that you feel seems right to you, keep a note of the length as a sort of bookmark that you can measure yourself against as you progress. Another thing that I find can be useful to do is to watch a variety of tutorials. This, of course, is a bit of a two-edged sword, as often we'll hear differing opinions of how something should be played. However, what I do find helpful is that different people will create tutorials from different perspectives. I mostly focus on how I went about practicing something, as opposed to how something should be interpreted. Others will focus almost entirely on interpretation, with very few hints as to how we might actually practice something. Others, of course, will do lots of analysis of the piece, and that can also provide great insights. Our second essential step is that of dividing the piece. Here I feel it falls quite nicely into 4 main sections that we can use to practice it. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the first section. Now, to further help speed up learning, I always split my sections into what I call segments. Here I opted for 4 of them. I'll generally base these segments on the musical design, such that often we can practice an entire segment in a similar way. Let's look then at the first segment. When I tried to play it through, the first thing I found difficult was in fact keeping the rhythm steady across these ties. It's fairly unusual to have a tie across a bar line in this way, and so we're less accustomed to counting this way. However, before jumping into practicing it, I did my usual step of subdividing into snippets to help me decide on things like fingering and also to identify anything that I find awkward. Indeed, as a general rule, I solve problems at the snippet level, but spend most of my initial time practicing at the segment level. For this particular segment, the notes are fairly simple, and so it didn't take much time to decide on my fingering scheme. As a result, I found it possible to practice it fairly quickly as an entire segment. Now, when initially practicing this, I simply ignored the tie lines across the bar lines. So rather than holding the note, I simply repeated it. This, to me at least, makes it far simpler to play and initially allowed me to really focus on the melody rather than having to devote thinking power to the left hand, which otherwise, as you can see, is just a simple pattern to play. I'd recommend continuing to practice in this way until we're 100% happy with how we phrase everything, with our pedalling, and of course the delicate balance. When I finally did include the ties, it was suddenly super easy. However, don't be afraid to go back to individual snippets or pairs of snippets initially as you reintroduce the ties. The next segment changes the musical design somewhat. Now we have longer flowing arpeggios in the left hand. Here, I feel we have an important decision to make. For these arpeggios, we can try to connect them in the fingers, or we can simply adjust the hand position. I know many of us are taught that we should always connect everything in the fingers whenever we can. However, especially with accompaniment figures like this, I don't necessarily ascribe to that theory. This piece is intended to be played with pedal, and the pedal will take care of connecting all of the notes for us. Indeed, if you have smaller hands, you might be surprised at how much better a result you will get by not trying to connect everything in the fingers. If, however, you feel you get a better sound by using finger legato, then by all means use that technique. As you'll notice, I normally mostly move my hand position as my hands are on the smaller side. Here I feel we have three nice little snippets to consider. Each arpeggio needs to flow effortlessly, so finding a fingering which permits this is important. Our legato strategy will of course influence our choice of fingering. Don't forget though to write in the fingering. However, once we do know which fingering we wish to use, I would start practicing using the add-on technique. Here we can simply start by playing only part of each arpeggio. I find this initial simplification helps with the right hand phrasing in that there is less to focus on in the left hand and the position changes are somewhat easier. Add all of the snippets together so that you can practice the entire segment using this simplified version. Once we're comfortable with this, we can go back to our snippets and add the remainder of the arpeggio too. Don't feel there's any need to rush forward here. You might want to spend a day or two simply practicing individual snippets so that you really feel the left hand is coming under control. Once we're happy, then we can start adding them together, first in pairs and then the entire segment. Our next segment introduces what for me was perhaps the hardest part in this piece, simply as a consequence of the size and shape of my hands. For me, the C minor chord in the right hand is a stretch, and I found it especially challenging at this particular point following the octaves. What I usually find is that any middle dynamic, there isn't too much of a problem. However, if trying to play either extremely quietly or extremely loudly, control becomes much more difficult. This in fact is one of what I feel is the biggest benefits of starting with snippets. We very quickly identify problem spots that we might otherwise not devote sufficient time to mastering. We can use the same basic technique that we used for the previous segment. Let's initially play only the first part of the arpeggio in each snippet. I spent much longer on the first snippet than any of the others simply because of the C minor chord. It's important here to experiment with different hand positions, higher or lower wrist, playing very close to the edge of the keys or more into the keys. Ultimately, it might actually be better to roll the chord rather than have either a ghost note or a bump. Of course, if your hands are larger, then this is unlikely to be an issue for you. In our next segment, there's another spot I found tricky. Getting from the top note of this particular arpeggio right back to the first note at the bottom for the next one is a big jump. However, a useful strategy is to simply redistribute the very top note of the arpeggio into the right hand, thereby giving the left hand a lot of time to get back down the keyboard. Again, we can practice this using partial arpeggios. Here, however, I would practice the entire upward arpeggio plus the jump back to the G alone. Here I split this initially into snippets of one measure and a beat so that we make the join each time. Another little tip here is to watch out for the fingering at this point. Here switching to the thumb removes the need to make any hand position jump at all. We change position, however we're anchored on a key in our current position. As we manage to master each individual measure, we can join them together first in pairs and then start practicing the entire segment. Our next section has a very different musical design. Now the melody has moved into the left hand, with the right hand taking over the arpeggiated accompaniment. For practice purposes, I split it into just a couple of segments. I found that it pays to take good care of the right hand fingering, bringing the thumb into play in order to switch from different hand positions rather than jump into the next one as we did above. This adds a little extra control. Equally, we need to find a good left hand fingering. I often find that the fingering in a score is not really that great for my hands. In this spot, for example, if I follow the fingering suggested in the score, I simply can't reach unless I jump over a key. Yet if I use 3 instead, it fits my hand perfectly. So first I worked out my fingering using snippets of 2 measures plus a beat. To help me focus more fully on the left, I then started to practice using block chords in the right hand. It's then possible to move to practicing the entire segment blocking the chords like this. I used a similar approach for the second segment. Another tip is that there is another bit of redistribution it's possible to do here. In order to ensure no bumpers, the right hand changes position here, we have the option of using the left hand on the A to give the right hand a little bit more time to move. I like having this additional time as it makes keeping things light so much easier. Our third section gives us a sort of bridge. Again, we can split this into a set of segments to help us with our initial practice. Our first segment is very chord-based. To help the articulation, I found it is useful to change fingers on the repeated chords. To get used to doing this, focus on using snippets of just a couple of measures. Wait until you're really confident with each individual one before adding them together. Some of them I found a little difficult to get used to as the harmony isn't quite what we might expect. When I practiced these, I simply repeated each one, first slightly under tempo and gradually building it up. Though of course it is never fast anyway. Keep doing this for as many days as you find helpful before you start to recombine them into a full segment. The next segment has yet another musical design. Again, it's worth focusing snippet by snippet initially. Note the triplets here too. Again, with smaller hands, this might be a little tricky as the hand is in an open position and we're trying to use 4 and 5 as a sort of mordant. We can experiment with rotation, curvature of the fingers, etc. to find a position that enables us to pull it off. The next segment has a few interesting challenges. Again, the melody has moved into the left hand. When I initially started practicing this, I used snippets of 2 measures plus 1 beat. I played uniquely the melody in the left hand and the 8th notes in the right, ignoring the additional accompaniment notes in each hand. In the next snippet, I personally found it a hit and miss to try and make the interval of a 7th at the point of playing the bass note. Thus, I opted to take the first of the triplets in my right hand. I could then comfortably manage the rest in my left as the pinky simply needs to rest on the note with gravity. I use the same trick in the following snippet. Again, start putting these together in pairs initially before starting to practice the entire segment. We then move into the final section. Our first segment has an interesting variation on the initial theme. Now, I couldn't find any ways of redistributing this and thus decided to follow Debussy's suggested distribution. However, I didn't find much benefit in working in very small segments, as here it's all about flow. Instead, I used the idea of add-on, but in multiple steps. First, we can practice just the melody using the correct hand to play each note. Next, we can add in the accompaniment notes in the left hand. Next, we can add in just the very top note of the right hand eighth notes. Finally, we can add in the rest. Again, my advice would be to do this over a number of days. If you manage to get step 1 in a single day, don't move on to step 2 yet. When you come back the next day, see if step 1 is still easy. You might find that if you're hesitating, if so, just stick with step 1 again. The remainder of this piece is largely the same as what we learned in the first section. The harmonies change somewhat, as do the dynamics, therefore we might want to spend a little extra time working on, say, the E-flat chord sequence. This particular snippet I found quite tricky initially, so I opted to start practicing using blocked duplets rather than separate notes. So I hope these ideas will have given you everything you need to get you started with this beautiful little piece. If there's anything else that you'd like, then please do leave me a comment and I'll do my best to answer for you. So before you go, I would just like to reiterate how important I think it is to get down to fairly small building blocks, or snippets as I keep calling them. My view is that if we find it difficult to get 2 measures correct with the right dynamics and the right tempo, then practicing 4 is really not going to help us. So by doing small chunks, we're able to solve all of the problems more easily, and we can then start progressively adding them together again. A good reason I think this works so well is that it helps us to keep to the level of manageable mistakes. So effectively, the fewer notes we start playing, the less mistakes we're likely to make within those notes, so it'll be easier for us to find those mistakes and to correct them. And I've linked a video here that goes into more detail on the idea of manageable mistakes. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit that little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.